And again, my name is Ankur Patel, Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America, and I am excited to bring you this special webinar on the Saraswati River, Archaeology and Chronology, featuring Michel Danino. Wow, there's so much here that I've been learning about in terms of the importance of the Saraswati River to the Vedic civilization. And we literally have the man who wrote the book on this. We're going to go into the correlations between the archaeological evidence and the literary information. And let me just give our Padma Shri a special introduction. Michel De Nino has been living in India since 1977, is now an Indian citizen, and again was a 2017 Padma Shri. An independent student of Indian civilization, Michel has authored The Lost River on the Trail of the Saraswati. He wrote that back in 2010, and several other books through his extensive career. Michel has lectured across India on many aspects of Indian civilization and culture. He's made presentations. In my last course, I even read up many of his papers, and it is amazing. He's twice been a scholar in residence at IIT Kanpur back in 2011 and 2014. He was a visiting faculty at IIM Ranchi, and since 2011 has been a guest professor at IIT Gandhinagar, where he has assisted the setting up of an archaeological sciences center. And he's also the convener of the International Forum for India's Heritage and is a member of the Indian Council of Historical Research. Dr. Danino, it's a pleasure to have you on with us today. And also with us is President of Hindu University of America, Sri Kalyan Vishwanathan, who's going to give us some context as we get started in this special webinar. Again, thank you all for joining us today. If you want to put in the chat where you're joining us from, it's always exciting to see the diversity of people who are interested in the topics that we bring you on these webinars. Kalyanji, why don't you take it away?
Great, terrific. A very warm welcome to all the participants in this webinar. I just want to acknowledge the participants from Australia who are up at 2 a.m. Or whatever the time is in Australia. We have people from Israel here, from South Africa, from all over the US, from India, from Bangalore, from Kunur, from the UK, from Leicester, UK. So we have a terrific group of people. A very warm welcome to every one of you. Now, in kicking off this webinar, I'd just like to say a few words at the beginning. One thing that's becoming increasingly clear is the reconstruction of the history of India, the Indian civilization, the Vedic civilization, is a very hotly contested topic with many different theories, with very emerging from different standpoints, different viewpoints. There is certainly the literary record, the archaeological record, the epigraphic record, and so many different ways of approaching the reconstruction of their history. And Michel De Nino has been hot on the trail of the river Saraswati for many, many years now. And he's really approaching this subject with a very strong foundation in archaeology, in what the archaeological record has to offer. And because it's physical evidence, it's sometimes incontrovertible evidence, in the sense that you can't quite dispute the clear dating of a certain artifact that has been dug up from the ground. The evidence has a certain solidity about it, which, for example, a text doesn't have. A verse from a text cannot so easily be pinned down as to when it was composed. It's a lot harder to do. It's more ephemeral. But the archaeological record tends to be a lot stronger in the sense of what it can reveal. So today we're going to hear from Michel De Nino, and we're going to hear largely about the work he has been doing and the conclusions that he has been drawing. and recognizing that all of these different pieces of the puzzle have to, at some point in time, they had to come together to tell a coherent story. We will today, look at what Michel Danino has investigated in some of the theories or conclusions that he's going to offer us. So, Michel, I'd like to start with a little bit of a biographical question, if you don't mind. We'd like to please tell our audience, how you got fascinated by this archaeology. Of all things, how did you stumble into this area, and just a little flavor of the journey you had in this domain. Okay, please, over to you.
Thank you. Namaste, Ankur. Namaste, Kalyanji. And thanks a lot for inviting me to this forum of Hindu University of America. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I believe we have a very wide audience, widespread geographically at least. So it's a privilege to address all of you. Your question would take a long answer or a short answer. I'll go for a short answer, which is that, I was drawn to India, again, very briefly by Sri Aurobindo. And when I started reading some of his books, especially from that point of view, those that dealt with the fresh look into the meaning of the Veda. So happens when he was writing between 1910 and 1914, the Indus or Harappan civilization had not yet been discovered. That was going to be a decade later. And yet he was emphatically rejecting this whole question of the Aryan invasion theory, which was very powerful in his days, and with the whole racial backdrop of the Aryan race invading India and dominating the autochthonous races and so on. The whole racial discourse that was going to amplify further and be eventually put to practical use, if I may say so, by Nazi Germany. So I was curious. I had a scientific education, and I always had some, casual but fairly deep interest in archaeology, even as a student. And I was curious because he was writing, after all, I was reading him in the 1970s, 80s. And, it was already 8 decades after he wrote his book. And his arguments were very rational, logical. And what was even more remarkable was that he was not actually trying to deal with the Aryan theory. He was trying to wrench the whole meaning out of the Rigveda. But it was almost like side remarks, that this is absurd because of this, because of that, and so on. And he showed that it was all, a kind of torture imposed on the text to force it to yield a battle between incoming Aryans and autochthon tribals or Dravidians or whatever. So this is what he really protested at. This was a way of demeaning. I'm not using his own words, of course. I'm trying to paraphrase what he was driving at. It was a belittling of the whole message of the Rigveda to transform it into a crude warfare between invaders and primitive autochthones or natives. So I was 7, 8 decades later wondering what it all meant, and what would archaeology, which I knew had developed and yielded quite a lot of fresh insights, and in particular a whole Bronze Age civilization called initially Indus Valley and later Harappan or Indus civilization. The word valley is still stubbornly present, but actually not justified, since we all know that the civilization extends all the way to the Iranian border, all the way to Uttar Pradesh, all the way to northern Maharashtra. So there's no question of the Indus Valley per se. Anyway, so what was the message of archaeology? What did he have to say on this question, for which Sri Aurobindo had strictly no archaeological inputs? That was my departure. And then I started, grabbing whatever books and papers I could lay my hands on. And I had the great privilege of being able to meet great archaeologists. In particular, and that was now 23 years ago, Professor Bibi Lal, Dr. S.P. Gupta, Dr. R.S. Besht, and they were all very warm and very patient with my, initially somewhat ignorant questions. And several more, Dr. V.N. Mishra, who worked so much at Deccan College, Pune, and several more. And also later on, a few non-Indian archaeologists like Mark Kenoyer, Jim Schaffer, very briefly, the French archaeologist Jean-François Jarige, and a few more. So this was my journey. I wrote a little book in English called The Invasion That Never Was, which was very popular in its days, didn't leave me really satisfied. And then I wrote a much bigger book in French in 2006, I think. And that book is still under adaptation and translation into English. It has gone through many ups and downs. I still hope one day to come out with it. It will be a very major study where I will be patient enough to look at all aspects of the problems as objectively as possible. You see, it's an extremely complex issue because it has so many ramifications. And the Saraswati River is just one of them. So there's archaeology, there's literature, there are cultural studies, there's anthropology, there's genetics now. There are so many other inputs like agriculture, metallurgy, and so on, which and each of them has its own complexities. So I'm trying to do justice to the complexity of the whole issue and not to rush to any conclusion, which is time consuming. And meantime, of course, I wrote this book on the Saraswati, which is due for a second revised edition. And maybe today we can have a glimpse at some of the fresh material since the book was written. Some new studies have come out. And a different picture, slightly different picture is emerging from the one I tried to build in the book. Though I also threw hints that perhaps the picture we had from a few leading archaeologists was not quite definitive. So anyhow, this is my not so brief answer to your question.
Okay, very good, Michel. Thank you. Just a quick note to our audience. First of all, it's a great audience. We have nearly 250 people in the webinar. My invitation to all of you is please listen patiently and put your questions in the Q&A box. Okay, we'll try to get to as many of them as possible towards the end of the webinar. But let's first hear what Michel De Nino has to say. So, Michel, let's start with the very first question. Why is the Saraswati River called a mythical river? In the sense, it's become a mythical river in the popular understanding.
Yes, you cannot read one article in the Indian press without the word mythical being attached to Saraswati. It's like so it's a cliche, and of course our journalists are not state-of-the-art researchers, so therefore they keep recycling whatever has been fed into the system. The Saraswati is mythical only in one respect, and that is at Prayag, or Prayagraj and former Allahabad, the Triveni Sangam. There it is undeniably mythical in the sense that it was a kind of device, very legitimate cultural device of attaching the Saraswati there, though it's invisible, it is adarshana, it is invisible. And therefore, you might say it's mythical in the sense that it is a part of the mythology of the location, or the sacred geography of the location. There it is justifiable. But when we go back to the Vedic period, and the Rigveda in particular, there's nothing mythical about the river. It is described with very physical, robust terms, like Giribhya Samudrat, from the mountain to the sea. It is located specifically, and I will not repeat all this because it has been said umpteen times, but it is in the Nadistuti Sukta of the 10th mandala of the Rigveda. It's very clearly listed between non-mythical rivers like Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Shutudri, which is Sutlej, and then it goes on with all the tributaries of the Indus, and finally the Afghan tributaries of the Indus. So there's nothing mythical about the Rigvedic context. Of course, it is true that Saraswati is the first river in Indian literature to be deified, to be turned into a goddess. Other rivers in the Rigveda, like Sindhu, for example, the Indus, are revered, are highly praised, but they're not deified. They don't become gods or goddesses. So it's the first time this happens, but that's no reason to say that the river is mythological when there are very, it bounces off the hills of the mountains. It is impetuous in its flow, etc. There are very physical descriptions. And it's not just the Rigveda. The later Vedic literature, like the Brahmanas, are even more precise, because then we have geographical indications. Still, the river is between Sutlej and Yamuna, but something has happened, whereas the river flows to the sea in the Rigveda with no further details. In the Brahmanas, it no longer does, and it breaks up at some point called Vinashana. Vinashana, in all Indian languages, we know what it means. Also, again, Adarshana, that's where the river becomes invisible. And in the Panchavimsa Brahmana, we have the first pilgrimage of India, the first Tirtha Yatra depicted in any literature, as far as I know. I'm not a great scholar of Indian literature, but as far as I've read, it's the very first where this Vinashana becomes a holy spot. And people start the pilgrimage from there, from the point where the Saraswati disappears, and go up towards its sources in the hills, in the mountains. This is even before the Mahabharata, where Balarama, we were discussing the other day, Kalyanji, you remember, will do exactly the same, but starting from the Gujarat coast, Prabhas, and wherever Prabhas might have been, it need not be today's Prabhas. Let's not go into such details now. And also follows the bed of the Saraswati upstream, stopping at places where it disappears again under the sands of the desert. And there are legends to explain this disappearance, and then there are ashramas punctuating the bed of the river. And here and there, the river still flows. And then he goes all the way up into the Shivalik hills, and we have very physical hints which are not important for the story, which makes them all the more important to us, because then there's no reason for them to have been invented or made up for some mysterious purpose. For example, one hint here is that when the final battle between Bhima and Duryodhana is going to happen after the war has ended, a messenger comes on horseback all the way up in the hills where Balarama is reveling delighting in the flow of the Saraswati and its source and so on, and informs him that tomorrow the final battle is happening, you must come. So on horseback, they can reach the spot, which is in Kurukshetra. And so therefore, this is all westward. This is all happening in the same location that Rigveda was describing between Yamuna and Sutlej. It's nothing to do with Prayag. It's nothing to do with the Gangetic region. And within one day, they are able to reach the spot of the last battle. So we can see clearly that all of this creates a very consistent picture through the literature of a river that somehow breaks up, goes into decline. And of course, there's mythology attached to it, the legends, for example, accounting for the disappearance of the river. But that is a standard feature happening with all rivers. The river itself is not mythical as per the Indian literature. So it's a completely unjustified. And we will see perhaps towards the end, why this whole became a kind of a controversy. But anyway.
Okay.
Keep that in mind.
Great, terrific. Michel. So, so obviously the next question is, when was the river actually identified as a physical river, and how did it happen? Why was it identified as Saraswati? Can you tell us that story? Yeah.
So this identification, you see, first of all, we should remember that it's a bit like asking the discovery of America, who discovered America, and we'll answer Christopher Columbus, forgetting that there were people who were living there and who had discovered the Americas before. Anyway, so here it's a bit of the same, there were people living in that region. And for some of them, at least, maybe not all of them, but for some of them, this was the Saraswati. So the tradition went on. It's not that, we had to wait for Europeans to come and tell us that this was the Saraswati. But
if I may interrupt,
yes,
the Europeans were on an age of discovery. They were discovering everything.
they were, certainly. And well, after all, they did great work in scholarship. We can't deny it. And though they also introduced very severe stereotypes, very severe biases, like I was mentioning as regards the Rigveda, and this whole Aryan myth was an absolute catastrophe, which we know how it ended during and before the Second World War. So anyway, the point is that Indians read texts with a certain mindset. So the shlokas of the Rigveda were known, they were repeated, but it took Europeans to ask where, when, how, all these questions are very European in nature. So that's fine. It's part of the knowledge. It may not be the essential knowledge for a text, but when the Europeans took up a text, they were always asking who wrote it, when was it written, how was it written, and so on and so forth. And the same thing happens with the Rigveda, which becomes known in the first decades of the 19th century in Europe. So in France, in England, in Germany, there are a number of scholars. Max Müller is the best known of them, but he was not the only one working on transcribing the manuscripts and compiling them and trying to make sense of what was this very revered text, of which a lot of European travelers had heard of. They'd been told about the Vedas, but nobody had seen them, nobody knew what they contained, and it was a big mystery. So once they started reading, so we will not deal into their interpretation of the Rigveda, which is a different topic, and I have hinted at it already. They came upon a number of features of descriptions. First of all, the geography is very clear. Sapta Sindhava is clearly referring to the Indus and its major tributaries, and there are a number of other rivers which were most of them identified. So we know that we are dealing with the northwest of the Indian subcontinent. We're not dealing with South India. We're not dealing with any other part of the region. So that was clear. And the rivers were also identifiable because they were either continuity of the terms, like Sindhu becomes Indus, there's no mystery, or sometimes through Greek terms for those rivers, the continuity of the terms could be reconstructed. So the rivers were all known, and there was, of course, Ganga and Yamuna, no mystery, but then there was this Saraswati. And they started asking, what is that river? Where is it? There was no, to their knowledge, in the early 19th century, there was no river by that name. So may I show a few slides? Because if I can show a few maps, it will help us. And so let me share my screen and show you. No, this is for later, perhaps, if time permits. That also. Let me. So this is what was happening. You see, I'll go full screen, hopefully, and my slides are visible. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So you see, this is what a map, and it's actually not the very earliest, but it's the clearest among the very early maps. And this is by James Rennell. In 1778, Rigveda is not yet known. The Rigveda is not yet read by anyone. Yet, just on the strength of the local traditions and local names, he picks up those names. And we are here in what would be, let us say, roughly Haryana. This would be, let us say, Haryana. And you can see Delhi here, the whole region of Delhi, and the city is here. Just let me see if I have a better pointer, which will be easier for you to follow. So this would be Delhi. And then you see how from the hills, which we call Shivaliks, and there are several names, Sirmur Hills and so on, you can see the Saraswati River. It's a name picked up in the region. There is no text as yet to speak of that river. And then there is this Kangar, which will be later on more cleanly spelled as the Gagar, 1778. Now you see, there are more maps. I'm not going to show you too many of those old maps. They kind of repeat Renel's map. But this is what happens, that there were also topographers, surveyors sent by the British to survey this entire region in the early 19th century, because they were looking for a road from Delhi right into Sindh. If you continue to the left of this map, you reach Sindh. If you continue, let's say, very horizontally. If you go towards northwest, you reach Punjab. But Maharaja Ranjit Singh was holding Punjab. And Punjab and Sindh were the two major regions still left to be conquered. So they thought at some point that perhaps they can find a road that would take them into Sindh without having to conquer Punjab on the way. And they sent explorers, military topographers and geographers, and they explored all this region. And they found that this was a desert region. This was an extension of the Thar Desert. But along this, which was a dry bed, these two were completely dry, and further downstream, they found that there were wells of fresh water. Whereas further out of the beds, away from the beds, there was brackish water. And their report, all the details are in my book, concluded that an army could use these dry beds as a superb route to walk into Sindh, and it would have fresh water along the way, which is, of course, of great importance if you move a whole army. So ultimately, they didn't have to use it because, well, Punjab fell apart. It's another story. They conquered Punjab first, and from Punjab, they conquered Sindh. Anyway, so the point is that this was when this French geographer, Louis Vivien de Saint-Martin, who did the first systematic study. There was a Christopher Lassen also in Germany before him, but he was not as thorough. So Vivien de Saint-Martin was a very famous geographer in his own time and was publishing atlas after atlas of little known, little explored regions of the world. And he took up the hymns of the description of the hymns and analysis of the hymns. He didn't know Sanskrit, but written by Max Muller, published by Max Muller. And he also was aware of the work of the British topographers and their reports. And he put two and two together for the very first time. He said, look, the Rigveda describes, actually, it's not two and two together, I should say three and three. Because one was the Rigveda and the description of the river between the Yamuna and the Satluj, which was the region explored by these topographers and surveyors and geographers. And it matched. There was a huge dry bed documented by them, huge in some parts, not in the upper parts, but in the lower parts. And thirdly, there was a local tradition which still had the name Saraswati. And Louis Vivien de Saint-Martin specifically mentions that local tradition. So putting all these three together, he said that has got to be the relic of the Vedic Saraswati River. And this is what he wrote in his book, a study on the geography and the primitive people of India's northwest, according to Vedic hymns, which was published in 1860, but written in 55. So this is how it all came together. And we had, after this, I can move quickly, lots of scholars picking up from there. Alexander Cunningham, founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, publishing maps with the Saraswati there, and other, I think my arrows have moved. It should be one arrow for these here, and the other is for the Gagar, river here. So, so Saraswati always presented as a tributary of the Gaga. And then there were two Oldhams, not related. One was R.D. Oldham and the other was C.F. Oldham, who wrote major papers on the whole bed all the way to the run of Kutch of this Ghaggar or Ghaggar Hakra river. Hakra is a name that was prevalent in the Bahawalpur region, what we call today Cholistan desert, and all the way to Sindh. So anyway, further studies followed, but basically we reached a consensus. And there was also a consensus that the later literature was consistent with a decline and disappearance of the river. This is a map created by the French Indologist Louis Renou towards the middle of the 20th century, great French Indologist who did a lot of work on the Rigveda also. And Renou recreated the geography of the entire Mahabharata region. So I'm only taking a small section of it here to show you, blown up somewhat, his location of the Saraswati. Drishavati we will ignore for the time being. It is identified with the Chotang or Chitrang river, which is a seasonal stream which breaks up somewhat in the center to join up again. And this joins a little lower than Kalibangan. We will see that site, I'm sure, a little later. And here you see how he points to this Vinashana, this point of disappearance of the river, described in several Brahmanas, the Panchavimsa Brahmana and the Jaiminya Upanishad Brahmana. So we get a very consistent picture, and then this is, what the geographers gradually built up, where this is the picture today of all these. I'm only showing here modern towns and cities, and all the tributaries of this somewhat complex system, actually very complex. You will see why a little later, where we have the Yamuna in the east and the Sutlej in the west. So therefore, this is a Doab region. It's a two-river or interfluve region. And it so happens, this we have to keep in mind, that it's an extremely flat region. There is hardly any difference of level, just a couple of meters perhaps between the bed of the Sutlej and the bed of the Yamuna. And and even between the Shivaliks, and this I don't remember now, but there could be not more than 100 meters of difference in altitude. It's an extremely flat region. You would, if you were to trek through it, you might not even notice any difference in level. So if you have a flat region, and this is equally valid for the Sutlej Valley, for the Yamuna Valley, you're going to have shifting rivers, especially if they carry as much sediment as Himalayan rivers do. So this is just a hint of the future complexity that we will be discussing. So just to sum up, and then of course, okay, this I could keep for later. This is Mark Orenstein's exploration of the same region in the early 1940s. And he published a paper called Survey of Ancient Sites Along the Lost Saraswati River, because there was a consensus by this time that this was the lost Saraswati. And we will see later what Orenstein discovered. And I should not be showing this, because what I wanted to show, my slides, I should have. This is what I wanted to show. That by the end of the 20th century, we have a beautiful consensus between the geographers, the geologists, the Indologists, all the way to the 19th century, and a number of archaeologists. I'm not showing all the names, but all of these mention Saraswati as being the, or rather the Ghaggar Hakra system as being the relic of the Saraswati of Vedic times. So this is the consensus. So that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, great, Michel. So I think the what you are establishing, which is important, I think, for our audience, is that Saraswati, the river Saraswati, is not some kind of a recent discovery. It didn't happen in the last 10 years. It didn't happen in the last 20 years. It didn't even happen in the last 50 years. It was already identified in the middle, in the 1850s, the middle of the 19th century,
Yes.
there was already a growing consensus that the river Saraswati was actually a physical river, and the Gagar is the relic of that river. So that, it is important to recognize, because very often it is presented in the public domain that, Saraswati has been recently discovered or something, but,
Yes.
what is really happening is there is a growing consensus across time that this river did actually exist in that particular part of the world. Okay, so now in order to move the conversation forward, nearly 70 years after the Saraswati River was first mapped as a physical river, there was a discovery of the two sites, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, on either bank of the river Indus, and that really upended, disturbed and completely challenged prior ideas about the chronology of India. So the question is now, how does the river Saraswati now connect with the discoveries of the Indus Valley civilization? So
Yes, and it's a fundamental question, because you see, if there had not been any Indus civilization, let's assume for a minute, then today nobody would be questioning the identification of the Saraswati. The story would be closed and over by, by the time that all these Indologists examine Vivien de Saint-Martin's theory, and they would all agree that it makes sense. And that would be the end of the matter. We wouldn't have heard of any sort of controversy or debate or whatever. However, as you said, in the 1920s, these two sites initially of Harappa first and Mohenjo-daro a year later, and then very quickly a few more in the Indus Valley, were identified as having a proto-historical culture going back to the Bronze Age. And it was the first time in India that any relics older than the Buddhist age, as in those days they were using religions to match archaeological periods, which is not a good idea, by the way. Anyway, today we don't do that, but the earliest archaeological remains were going back to the times of the Buddha, and they were the cities that are described in the Buddhist literature. And this was all, perhaps roughly about 500 BC, and that was the earliest time that all scholars were agreeing upon. And suddenly here is a culture which doesn't know iron, which has a lot of bronze and copper objects, and which has those mysterious seals that had actually been known since the 19th century. Some had been picked up here and there on the surface or through, clandestine limited excavations. And a few of these Harappan or Indus seals, which we are familiar with now, were already in the British Museum and were known to John Marshall, head of the Archaeological Survey of India in the 1920s and 30s. So suddenly, when more of these seals came to light, then Marshall thought that this was certainly the origin of those seals. And he published an article in 1924 in a magazine of London, publishing the seals and asking scholars whether they had anything to say about, because the period of the civilization was still not clear. Bronze Age is a very elastic term, you see. So within a week, he had answers from Assyriologists. And they told him that, we know your seals. We know your seals because we found a few in the Mesopotamian cities. Mesopotamian excavations had been going on for quite a while already. It was far more advanced than archaeology in India. And they had found these mysterious, unreadable, undecipherable seals, which were totally unlike standard Mesopotamian seals. So suddenly they put two and two together and they said, well, this civilization in Northwest India must be the origin of these seals, and therefore the two must be contemporary. And this gave the first bracket of dates for the Indus or Harappan civilization. Okay, it's a long story. We don't have to go into this. The chronology was much refined later. And initially, as I said, almost all the sites were limited to the Indus Valley and Balochistan, a little bit on the Makran coast, and one or two, there was one which was Rupar, towards a little bit east of the Indus Valley proper, but that was about all. And then this gentleman, Sir Mark Orelstein, a great explorer, he did fantastic explorations in Central Asia, in the then Chinese Turkmenistan, brought back a lot of Buddhist manuscripts and artifacts. And at the age of 78, he had a hunch that there had to be Harappan sites east of the Indus Valley. So he started his exploration with the help of the Maharaja of Bikaner, and then there was the state of Bahawalpur, which today, of course, is in Pakistan. And initially, he started with an automobile given to him by the Maharaja, but very soon the terrain did not allow this, and then he stopped at Kalibangan and kind of missed the character of Kalibangan. He was a bit in a hurry, but in Bahawalpur, he did not miss the proper cultural context of the sites he came across. He was on horseback, he was on camelback, by the end of this season, he had identified a number of typically Harappan pottery and a few seals and some other typical Harappan objects in some of these sites. So this was his major discovery, that there are Harappan sites east of the Indus Valley. And the story continues after independence, and this is what happens, where we have now the international border. If you can see my cursor, is going to be somewhere here. So some of the sites discovered by Orelstein were here, and there's a huge site still largely unexcavated, which is Ganwariwala. There's a more recently discovered site like Mohenjo-daro, which is potentially as large as Mohenjo-daro. Harappa, of course, is here. And in India, we have Dholavira in Gujarat, a very impressive and large site, and Rakhigari, which has been excavated for several years now in Haryana. And but then you see that these sites were identified after independence, after the partition, when Indian archaeologists felt suddenly orphaned, because previously Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were in India, and Indian archaeologists could go and explore them and study the artifacts anytime. And now this was in a different country. So all this civilization, was as if lost again for Indian archaeologists, and they were unhappy. There was only the site of Rupar, and there was Rangpur in Saurashtra, which had been identified as Harappan, and that was all. So they started, and this was A. Ghosh, who was Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India in the 1950s, and he started this exploration, revisited Kalibangan, which Orelstein had visited, but too hurriedly, identified it as properly Harappan, and then, of course, it went on and on. And by now, we have actually, the final figure is not very, very clear, but it's about 1,500 sites of the mature Harappan phase in the basin of the Saraswati. So by basin, I mean all the tributaries of the present Ghaggar-Hakra system, and inclusive of the full bed here. So mature means simply urban. And you can see at the bottom of the slide, this slide is by my colleague, Dr. V.N. Prabhakar, formerly of Archaeological Survey of India, and now with us at IIT Gandhinagar. And you can see that the dates for the urban phase, where you have the full-fledged cities, Harappan cities, is limited to about 700 years between 2600 BC and 1900 BC. So this is what is visible. And you see, it took a lot of time to figure out the presence of all these sites in the Saraswati basin. It took decades altogether. So it's only in the 1980s that the entire picture emerge. This is my own map. It has to be updated because, in fact, many more sites have been discovered since. And you have again Kalibangan. You have important sites like Banawali, Birana, which are actually located, we can see that later perhaps, on branches of this bed of the Gaga. Because you see, we are drawing very neat lines for the beds of the rivers. But I'm going to show you a little later, if we deal with the scientific evidence, that there's nothing neat about the actual courses of those rivers. They've been shifting a lot. And therefore, they are actually also on paleo beds or ancient beds of this whole system. So this is what basically happened. Okay, this we have seen. This is basically what happened, and this is maybe for another part of the discussion. So therefore, initially there was no controversy again. It's just that the understanding accumulated that there are hundreds and hundreds of Harappan sites, and of all three phases. The early phase, prior to the urban development, that starts about 3,500 BCE. The mature phase, urban, 2,600 BCE, and the late Harappan phase after the collapse or disintegration, let us say, of the urban order. So that is from 1900 all the way to 1300 BC or so. It depends on the exact region. So this is the picture that archaeology built up, that there were actually more sites in the Saraswati Basin than there were in the Indus Valley proper. But let's not forget that if these are the two main heartlands of the civilization, there's also Balochistan, which has quite a lot of sites relatable to the Harappan culture, but with some strong regional development. Gujarat, which is neither in the Indus nor in the Saraswati Valley, except perhaps for the run of Kutch, but that is still uncertain. Gujarat has something like 800 Harappan sites, Gujarat alone, as per the latest surveys. But most of them, not all, about I think 100 to 200 are proper Harappan sites. The rest are Sorat Harappan sites, which is a regional variation of the Harappan culture. It's not fully classical Harappan. It's a kind of an adaptation to the region. So the picture is complex, and altogether we still don't have a final number of how many sites this civilization included. If you are going to include all the regional variations, it could be 3,000 to 4,000 sites. And the point is that we don't know how many small rural settlements were there. You see, we think there's a misconception in the media, in the popular mind, that Indus or Harappan civilization is an urban civilization. Yes, it was urban, but it was also rural. It had certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of rural settlements because it needed to control the agricultural surplus that was going to feed the cities. The cities would not have been sustainable without a good control and development of the rural hinterland. So these are very important things to keep in mind.
Yeah, very good. Michel, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep this moving a little bit, if you don't mind, right? Yeah. So, can we now move to what is the current state of research on the Saraswati River, and what are the implications for the early chronology of the Indian civilization?
Yes. So I'll try to make this a little brief. Yeah. First of all, and we need not spend much time on it, there were, from the 70s onward, there were satellite surveys, satellite imagery, all over the globe. And when this region was examined, there were clear marks of paleo beds. So the Gagar and this small Saraswati, which is still here, so they were delineated right from 1980 onward. So the picture became more complex, and you see ISRO or ISRO also jumped into the fray at some point and started plotting Harappan sites along the bed of the bygone Saraswati. And then it realized that there was not one bed, but many beds. And here on the upper left part of the picture, you have a number of beds that the Saraswati may have occupied while shifting in the course of time. It's even possible that it shifted gradually to the actually, it's not really known in which direction it evolved, but it might have shifted from this eastern part to the more towards the west. In any case, some of the paleo beds do end up in the Rann of Kutch, where Dholavira is located, and we are conducting at present research on the Rann of Kutch, several teams of researchers, but one of them from our IIT here, to determine, the impact of riverine fluvial activity in the Rann of Kutch. So there are many, many unknowns there. So I won't develop all this, but more research went on and more paleo beds were identified until, and let me just show you, one of the very recent studies, compiling a lot of remote sensing studies and showing that there is hardly any spot between Yamuna and Sutlej, which is not the location of a paleo bed. Why? Because these rivers kept shifting all the time. And the Sutlej itself, part of the Sutlej, maybe not all of it, probably only a branch of the Sutlej, was earlier, and a branch of the Yamuna, were earlier feeding into the Saraswati, and they also gradually moved away, probably because the whole interfluve was tectonically upraised. So this is the kind of complexity that we have, which means that it's going to take decades before the complete hydrological reconstruction of the region can be reliably done. So anyway, and then there are other kinds of studies, like resistivity studies, which were made by a number of researchers, including Rajiv Sinha of IIT Kanpur, where you put electrodes and you measure the underground conductivity of the soil, and that gives you a measure of how much humidity water is trapped, and you can measure the depth and so on. And what was proved through these studies is that there are huge resources of underground water, and some of them had been dated to remote ages under this whole Ghaggar system. So this was a kind of a confirmation that there had been. You can see here in blue, the sand saturated with fresh water going to a depth of more than 100 meters. And this shows that there was a relic, definitely, of an ancient river. So, however, the sediment studies gave a slightly different picture. And you see, I'm borrowing from a recent study here, a picture, Anirban Chatterjee at PRL, where you can see some of the ancient, this is on the top, you have silty clay, but you have gray micaceous sand, which is of Himalayan origin. And the big question that geologists have tried to resolve in recent times was, when did the Saraswati or Ghaggar Hakra have contributions from the Himalayas? Now, there's a certain consensus which has built up. Okay, I'll skip this. These are the kind of complex lithologs or, cores drilled into which shows you all the different types of sediments. And you have this gray, again, here you have this gray micaceous sand, which is of Himalayan origin, but not everywhere. So it depends where you drill, and this is going to shift a lot as you move across the region. So the point is, let me not read this quotation in the interest of time, but the point is that this whole system is very complex, and our earlier image of it was simplistic. And whereas earlier some geologists were in favor of recent glacial contributions, Himalayan contributions to the Saraswati system, the consensus now is that this happened sometime before 8 or 12,000 years ago. It is not recently that the Himalayan rivers like the Yamuna or Sutlej, or some direct connection between the Saraswati and the higher Himalayas, it was not in operation recently. It goes back many millennia. So this is something for which there is a kind of an agreement. However, again, Anirban Chatterjee studying, and you can see how they study all kinds of gastropods, shells that are picked up, because shells can be radiocarbon dated, plus the sediments themselves from a number of locations. This is typical of all those studies. But his conclusion, this was done at PRL with Jyoti Ranjan Roy, his conclusion was that though the majority of the dates were indeed very ancient, KY stands for kilo years, thousands of years, at the same time, there were a few dates which were odd, which were outliers and far more recent, going all the way to the Harappan time. So it could be that depending on the exact location where you drill, you get a very different picture.
So, Michel, just quickly, so are you talking about, when you say 36 KY, you're talking about 36,000 years ago?
Years ago. Yes, yes.
19,000 years ago.
Yes. In fact, the higher regime of that river system, the Saraswati River system, is anytime between 40,000 years ago and let's say 10,000 years ago. That is its higher regime. From 8,000 BC, it seems that it begins to be abandoned, first of all, by the Yamuna and later on by the Satluj, although the exact chronology remains to be worked out. But by the time, and as Anirban Chatterjee's study shows, there could be also some revival, occasional revival. Just because the Satluj abandons the Saraswati system, it doesn't mean that part of it cannot come back at some point, because it takes very little. There's so little difference in the altitude for paleo channels to be reactivated. And it seems that even during medieval times, there was still some reactivation of some some channels connecting the Satluj with the Saraswati happening. So the picture
Michel, just to clarify, when you say the Saraswati was abandoned by the Yamuna or abandoned by the Satluj, what exactly does that mean?
What this means is that possibly, you see, this interfluve region was very flat. Possibly it was tectonically uplifted. And then the Yamuna and Satluj, which did have connections earlier with the Ghagar, and the paleobeds are there to show it, they moved away because this was now higher ground. This could be one reason. There could also be rivers also can shift because they deposit sediments. And when they deposit sediment, they aggrade, as the geological term says, and then they are forced to move away and find another bed because they've deposited too much sediment. So again, it's a very complex picture happening, and we can still have about 4,000 BC, as you can see here, and even all the way to the early Harappan phase, we can still have some contributions from the Himalayas. It is not yet ruled out, though they will be sporadic probably. So now there is, and there's more research. This is one project which we did recently with Ajit Singh, postdoctoral fellow at our institute, and Vikram Jain and others, and where we examined one major tributary of the Ghagar system, which is the Markanda River, which flows into Haryana, flows down from Himachal Pradesh into Haryana. And this Markanda River can be quite powerful at times. Now it is totally seasonal. And we examined this whole valley. You can see here, this is the black square, shows you the area of our research project, which was concluded about 2 years ago. And you see, counterintuitively, we found that there were still floods happening even in 1800 BC, even though the Saraswati is supposed to have disappeared at that time, and I'll show why. There were still massive floods happening, and which could have sustained flows further downstream, and therefore the late Harappan civilization. So this is something which was a bit counterintuitive. And now you see the whole debate is this, and this is still going on among geologists and archaeologists. The question is whether, if the Himalayan sources, contributions, brought through the Yamuna, through the Sutlej, or through maybe some upper connection of the Ghaggar itself, had disappeared during the mature Harappan phase. This Ghaggar river or Saraswati, the relic which remained, was it perennial or not? So I'll not go into all the arguments, but whereas some geologists argue that it could not have been perennial, it had become seasonal, the archaeologists usually disagree because they consider that there are lots of cities. Here you see Kalimangan, and you see on the upper part of the slide how it is right on the edge of the Ghaggar River. You have Banawali, and Kalimangan was excavated by Professor Bibilal and B.K. Thapar in the 1960s. Banawali excavated by Dr. R.S. Bisht, and you see bottom left of that slide, dry bed of the Saraswati. You have, this is Bhirana, and it is also on one channel of the Ghaggar. So all these cities would not have been constructed right on the banks of a river if it had dried up by the time. Therefore, archaeology strongly supports the fact that even though the Saraswati may have been considerably diminished during the mature Harappan phase, it was still flowing perennially. And this map shows us that there are quite a few settlements along the paleo channels, and that itself is a strong indication that they were flowing. Otherwise, they would not be there. Maybe I can avoid this conclusion because maybe I think we still need to briefly discuss one last point about, why has it become a controversy, and what is the implication, as you mentioned earlier, on the chronology of ancient India.
Yeah. Why don't you take that up? Why is the river Saraswati River so controversial, and what is driving the controversy?
So the controversy can be summed up by these three maps, where you have the early Harappan phase on top, and the mature Harappan phase in the center, and the late Harappan phase after 1900 BC at the bottom. Now, briefly, what happens is that you can see a complete abandonment of the central portion of the Saraswati. I'll show you better maps. These were mine, but you can see here, this is the early and mature phase. These are different researchers, Joson and Clift. And you can see that there are sites almost continuously in the Saraswati basin, but then you can see that after 1900 BC, there is a big discontinuity, and suddenly the sites are all concentrated close to the hills or in the plains at the bottom of the hill. This is a still better map by V.N. Prabhakar, where you can see that after 1900 BC, these are the late Harappan settlements. Again, all this is totally abandoned. So something has happened to the river. Now, this is where the controversy took place, because the literature did tell us that the river was disappearing. But when does it tell us? In the Brahmana literature, not in the Rigveda. For the Rigveda, the Saraswati flows continuously. It doesn't mention that it's lost anywhere. And therefore, this would normally date the Rigveda to the phase where the river is flowing continuously. And that's before 1900 BC. In fact, it is even before 2700 BC, because at 2005 or 600, during the mature phase, there is already a first break happening here, which was noticed by the Pakistani archaeologist Rafiq Mughal. And he said there's a break, the river must have broken down. And this is even before the urban phase. So it would show that the Rigveda dates back to just before the urban phase of the Harappan civilization. And that would be 2700 BC or so. Now, this is, of course, not something, and maybe I can stop my sharing my screen now. It is not something that the conventional theory of Indian chronology based on the Aryan invasion or migration theory is prepared to accept, because it wants the Rigveda to be datable to about whatever, we have various dates, but 1500 BC is the average. Some will say 1700, some will say 1200 BC, but they're not ready to consider that the Rigveda would be pre-Harappan or Harappan. It would only be post-Harappan. And the Harappan civilization would be pre-Vedic, therefore. That is the mainstream theory still in force. And that is why a number of us have been contesting, a lot of Indian scholars, of course, Shrikant Talagiri of late, Western scholars like David Frawley, Nicholas Kazanas, Conrad Est, but also a number of archaeologists have in any case rejected the entire reality of an Aryan migration into India. So without going into the details, the point is that if you accept the description of the river that the Rigveda gives it, and you're not going to torture the text, if you accept the verdict of archaeology that this river system, whatever name you give it, has a first break around 2700 BC and totally collapses by 1900 BC, then you have to put two and two together and accept that the Rigveda is of much older time, and it would be contemporary, therefore, with the Mesopotamian civilization, which on other levels, like mythology, we won't go into that today, comparative mythology, makes a lot of sense. So this is why suddenly we have a controversy erupting, even though there was no controversy in the 19th century. Even the defenders of the Aryan invasion theory, like Max Muller, were very happy with the whole consensus around the Saraswati. But now people have to reinvent the Saraswati because the data doesn't fit their theory. So in good science, where data doesn't fit your theory, you look at your theory and you question it. But in history, when there's too much of ideology, you do the opposite. You're going to change the facts because you don't want to change your theory. So therefore, suddenly Saraswati found itself relocated to Afghanistan, or in any case, it was simply no longer acceptable that the Ghaggar should be the Saraswati River. So that's the short of it.
So basically, Michel, to sum up the controversy, the Saraswati River, unfortunately, pushes back the date of the so-called Aryan invasion of India, or migration or immigration, whatever name we call it, from 1500 BC. If such a thing ever happened, it happened before 2700 BCE, which is when the first break is noticed. And of course, as you pointed out, the Rigveda doesn't even know of the break in the river Saraswati. So that's the place where it's become all controversial, and there is much disagreement about and of course, there is a corollary of the conclusion that perhaps if the Rigveda was indeed, say, composed or collected together in that period, 2700, 3000 BC and before, then what does that make of the Indus, so-called Indus Valley civilization, and all of these Harappan sites? They become the seat of the Vedic civilization, and that's where the whole controversy becomes almost unacceptable to mainstream historians, right? Am I summarizing the controversy?
Yes, and in fact, now the whole question, as you rightly say, of the nature of the Harappan culture has to be re-examined. And you have, for example, on the one hand, scholars like Professor Bibilal R.S. Bisht, who read a lot of Vedic culture in Harappan remains, structures and artifacts. And this was to some extent accepted even by conventional archaeologists who still thought about, the Aryan invasion, like the late Raymond Alchin was willing to concede that there were Vedic elements in the Harappan culture. But now this has become, very controversial. And one by one, even though there was a consensus, for example, that there were fire altars in Kalibangan, in Lothal, in Banawali, some scholars go into very convoluted arguments to try to reject this identity. So one by one, all objects are re-examined, and then there's a great effort involved to prove that Harappan culture has nothing to do with the Vedas. It may have, I would not say, my own conclusion is not that Harappan culture is 100% Rigvedic or late Vedic culture. It is that there are many bridges between the two. I don't expect the Vedic rishis to have gone and lived in Harappan cities. I think they were on the margins rather. This is at least my theory, but it's open to reinterpretation later. But I think that the core of the Vedic culture, as we read it in the Rigveda, is marginal to the Harappan civilization, but there was a lot of interaction, and much of it is still visible in the iconography, in a number of objects. All this has been explained very often, and I have 2 chapters in my book on documenting those bridges between Harappan culture and Vedic culture. So I'm not saying that they are one and the same. I'm saying that Harappan culture is a popular culture. What remains in the archaeological record is only a fraction of what was there in the actual life of the society. We don't see more than 5 or 10%. So it is a popular culture which comes through, whereas the Rigveda is not exactly something for popular consumption. It is a specialized effort by a community of poets and singers and seers. So I will not put the same exactly on the same level, the two on the same level, but I think there are lots of connections.
Okay, so let's take a few questions from the audience. I'm just going to select some questions from the Q&A box. Is there any connection between the current Saraswati River at Ahmedabad and the old Saraswati River, or are they completely different?
I think if it is Prayag, I would say that there is no connection except that the Yamuna was...
No, Ahmedabad, not Allahabad, Ahmedabad.
There is no Saraswati in Ahmedabad.
Okay.
Though there is one, I think probably the questioner means there's a small Saraswati which flows down from the Aravalli hills into the little run of Kutch in Gujarat. Yes. But we have 20 Saraswatis in India. There's one in Bengal, there's one through Indo, there is one in Uttarakhand. These were later Saraswatis which were named so that the original river, the first river goddess, would not be forgotten. Yeah. So as an homage to the lost river, a lot of minor rivers were given that name. There's no other connection.
Just like in almost every American city, there is a Martin Luther King Boulevard.
Yes.
I mean, it's not uncommon.
You have York and you have New York.
That's right.
That's the only connection between the two.
Yeah. All right. So let me see. Let's see. Here's a question from another person. Can you throw some light on what the Western historians make from the claim that there is an absence of the evidence of horses in the archaeological sites? Anything you want to say about that?
I don't know if we should go into that, because this is, to me, essentially, first of all, a misreading of the Rigveda. And I have written a long paper, which you will find on my academia page. I can share the link, but anyway, if you just put my name and academia.edu, you will find my page. And the paper is called Demilitarizing the Rigveda. And building up on the work of several scholars, including Sri Aurobindo, I try to show that the military context of the Rigveda and Aryans coming on horseback or horse-drawn carts is completely misleading, and it's a complete misinterpretation of the Rigveda. So first of all, the horse was not a central or important animal in the Rigveda. And number two, there are a few horse remains in the Indus civilization, and even 1 or 2 realistic horse depictions. So you'll have to read my paper, and also another older paper called The Horse and the Aryan Debate, where I put more emphasis on the archaeological evidence. So I think this would take it, because otherwise it's a we have to bring out all the, arguments and evidence.
Yeah.
So,
all right. So next question, how do you situate chronologically the Tirtha Yatra of Balarama described so vividly in the Mahabharata? Your thoughts on that, please.
well, see, I'm not trying really to put dates on it because these are obviously traditions brought into a text. There is a pilgrimage, and it is now attributed to Balarama. Whether that is historical or not, we need not worry about that. But the point is that what we can say for sure is that the Mahabharata is aware of that pilgrimage, and it is apparently more extensive than it is in the Brahmana period. So it's difficult to put dates, and I'm not going to go into dating the Mahabharata, but the state of the river, which corresponds to this Tirtha Yatra, is sometime in the second millennium BC. Okay, could be anything after 1500 BC. It could be. This is where we will have a broken up river that more or less matches what we find in the text. That is compatible at least with it.
Yeah. So, here's an interesting question. Is there any mention of the river Saraswati in the Ramayana?
There is a brief mention. I mentioned it in my book. When I think it is when, if I remember right now, I think it is when Bharata comes back from Gandhara, if I remember well, upon hearing the news of the crisis in the palace, and then he crosses the Saraswati on the way. I think this is where it is mentioned, but it's a brief mention. There's no development on it.
So the complete disappearance of the river Saraswati could be placed to around 1800 BC, 1900 BC.
You see, complete is a tricky term because it never happened. It never completely disappeared, since the Gagar River remains as a seasonal. And in 2000, when was it? 2019, there was a very massive monsoon, and we happened to be visiting Shimla, and we came back, and we visited a number of sites in Haryana alongside this small Saraswati, and the Gagar, and we saw the Gagar in full might. And it was not a puny river. It was not a small river. It was massive. I have a video I could show of the Gagar as almost 1 kilometer broad. So it is still existing, but it's become seasonal. However, what you mean is the disappearance probably of the central basin, the central part. It seems to happen very clearly in 1900 BC. And what I forgot to point out, and it's important to remember that, is that there are no late Harappan sites. You see, if the civilization had simply collapsed, the urban order had collapsed, but the river was still there, we would have late Harappan sites in the central basin of the Saraswati. We don't. Kalibangan, for example, or Banawali or Bhirana are important urban sites, mature Harappan sites. They don't have a late Harappan phase. People just go, they abandon the cities. And the most likely reason, in the absence of warfare, there's no sign of warfare, no sign of human destruction, is simply that, the one thing you need most is water, because agriculture would still be workable to some extent. But if you don't have water, you have to go. There's no alternative.
Yeah.
So this is sometime after 1900 BC. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, there are many people in India, all over India today, who identify themselves as the Saraswat people. They say we are the Saraswat Brahmins, and we are from that Saraswat region, though they are scattered today. Do you have a sense of their origins and the stories they've kept alive?
They do have a tradition, though I would like to find some, 19th century narration of that tradition, not too recent, because it has got a little altered with the discovery of the Indus civilization. But they do have a tradition that they come from the Saraswati River. So now some Saraswats will tell you that, yes, we are the descendants of the Harappans, but that of course is constructed after the discovery of the civilization. So it does seem, you see, we know for sure that the Harappans migrated towards the Shivaliks. We see all these clustered late Harappan sites, probably a little bit towards south and also towards Kashmir. And therefore, there's no reason to doubt the tradition. And then from there, you see, they migrated further south in waves. And if they followed the coast at some point, they went to Goa, this whole region, and further south. So I think the tradition must have, as often, traditions are traditions. You may believe or disbelieve. It's hard to prove or disprove them. In this case, I see no reason to disbelieve the tradition. I think that this migration of communities has happened all the time across India for various reasons. Some, like here, might be environmental. You might have sometimes economic crisis. You might have famines. You might have political crisis. Tipu Sultan triggered a lot of migrations from the Karnataka region and so on. So this is my brief answer. I think it's and I would like to research it more. I mentioned it briefly in my book, and I've got some further documents which I will integrate in the new edition of the book.
Yeah. Now, this the Triveni Sangam in Allahabad, Prayagraj, it does maintain the memory of the river Saraswati, in a very real, every 12-year festival, which is so famously known. How do we interpret that the river Saraswati participating in the Triveni Sangam, in your view?
So, as I said, Kalyanji, I think it is primarily to be taken as a cultural device. It is that the late Harappans would have carried with them the memory of the Saraswati. Some of them migrated into the Ganges plains. They already knew the upper part of the Ganges Yamuna plains. So they wanted to keep this memory. And maybe also some Harappan sites were along the Yamuna. So the Yamuna was also a river familiar with them. And then they came upon the Ganges, and they decided to fix this memory at this spot, which for some reason they regarded as especially holy. Confluences of rivers in India are very often regarded as especially holy. And we have other Triveni Sangams, by the way. In India, there's one in Saurashtra with a small Saraswati, little north of Prabhas, Patan. I'm aware of a Triveni Sangam in Tamil Nadu, etc. So this is a perfectly valid, legitimate way of fixing the memory on the land, and that's how you create a sacred geography. And India is full of such stories. But there is, to me, no physical reality of the river except through the Yamuna itself, which once upon a time had a connection with the Saraswati. But otherwise, no. People say there's an underground river. Very often you hear that. I don't think that's correct, no. Anyway.
It's probably more appropriate to say the Yamuna sort of brought the Saraswati along with her, rather than to say that there is an underground river called Saraswati.
You could, if you wish, you can say that. Yes.
Right. Okay. Now let's see. Now let's talk about Dholavira for a moment. It is a big site, and it is in the Rann of Kutch area, and it's also very close to, reasonably close, I would say, to IIT Gandhinagar. Is there a special relationship in the researches that you are conducting from IIT Gandhinagar with the site in Dholavira itself? And are there any unique findings that you want to speak about?
We have been, you see, after the excavations were conducted from about 1989 to 2005 under the direction of Dr. R.S. Bisht of Archaeological Survey of India. There have been a number of people doing occasional research because the site is so rich, so vast. It's one of the largest Harappan sites in India with Rakigari, that there's immense potential for research, and no more than, again, 20% of the site has been excavated. So, excavation is one way of looking at a site, but then you can look later at the ancient flora, that is paleobotanical research. You can look at the ancient fauna, and we have actually one major research on the ancient fauna of Dholavira, which is being initiated at the moment. We have conducted a drone survey with 3D imagery. We had to highlight minute details, and we're going to transform this into a complete 3D mapping, ideally, of the site. We also have a DST-funded project on the whole geology of the site and the critical question of the sea level during the time of Dholavira, when the city was thriving. How high was the sea? And was it really the sea, or was it river water? This is a major question, and we have preliminary findings, which I can't reveal, they're not yet published, which are slightly counterintuitive. So there are lots of complex issues, and there's tectonics, which may uplift the area. Then you have the sea level, which has its own curve of evolution. You have sediments getting deposited both by the rivers and by the sea. So all this still has to be worked out, and we are trying to contribute to this.
Okay, very good. So next question, is there any reference to the Saraswati River or the Indus Valley civilization people in the records of the Mesopotamians or Hittite or Egyptian early records, that you know of? Is there anything there that can be correlated?
So this is well known. With the Egyptians, no. But in Mesopotamia, it's quite well known that they refer Sargon the Great, for example, in 2350. There are tablets referring to Meluha as a region from which goods are imported, and ships are coming to Meluha, are docking at Mesopotamian cities. So this is the literary evidence, and the kind of goods that are described perfectly match things like beads, like exotic animals, like monkeys and peacocks, various items which have been correlated with things exported from the Harappan civilization. Apart from that, and that is even more secure, the Harappan presence has now been very firmly established all along the Persian Gulf, starting from Oman, Kuwait, all the region of the Emirates. There is Harappan pottery, there are seals, there are even probable colonies of Harappan traders settling down, and all the way to Mesopotamia at the top of the Gulf. So this is a well-known story. There's quite a lot of writings by various archaeologists, Gregory Possel, the French, Serge Clesiou, and quite a few others. So, and there's always fresh evidence coming to light, because quite a lot of excavations are going on in Oman and in Kuwait and other sites by people like Denis Frenes, Akinori, and others. So this is a well-known story, which is actually getting further enriched all the time.
Okay, wonderful. Just a final question, then we'll end the webinar today. So as we look to the future, with settled, entrenched narratives in place about the chronology and history of the region and so on, what do you see is the task ahead in terms of converging all the different bodies of research and evidence and hypotheses and speculation? How do they come together to form some sort of a credible reconstruction of the historical narrative?
That's a very difficult question, Kalenji. and because we can endlessly discuss this, because simply, first of all, there may be as many views as there are scholars eventually. It's not always, someone like a good friend like Shrikant Talagiri disagrees with me on a number of issues. I disagree with him on some. But we may fundamentally agree on others. So this will go on for quite some time. You see, we need certain clinchers at some point if we wish to move forward. Because otherwise, of course, there are things which are indicative. There are lots of clues, lots of hints, but there's so much of politics and so much of ideology. And of course, the leftist historians blame Hindutva on views like the identity of the Saraswati, forgetting that this was completely established by Western scholars in the 19th century. Of course, conveniently forgetting all of that, and therefore, to move forward in this debate, which is hardly a debate, it's more like a fish market bedlam. We need some clinchers. So one, of course, would be a decipherment of the Indus script that would be completely accepted by all, or let us say, 90% of those in the fray. This is not happening. There are many people claiming that they have deciphered the Indus script and proposing very, very different solutions, very different. And this is from the very beginning, you see. So there's nothing which will as yet allow a final reading of the script. So if we knew, at least, for example, if let us say tomorrow, someone establishes or a bilingual, completely bilingual tablet emerges from Oman, as might happen someday, we don't know, and establishes that this is an Indo-European language, that the Harappan language was Indo-European, obviously the consequences would be enormous. So if, on the other hand, it turns out to be some other kind of language, then again, we may have to reconsider and realize. So this is the kind of clincher I have in mind. Otherwise, the slow accumulation of evidence from archaeology will help us to refine our understanding of the Harappan society and culture. But that's a slow procedure. It will take time. And unfortunately, a lot of sites are being lost in the process. Destroyed by urbanism, by farming, and so on. So as far as if you say that, okay, let us all work with what exists today and try to put up one coherent narrative, I am not very optimistic that you will be able to convince scholars, even scholars of one school of thought, to come up with the same narrative. Even among archaeologists I know, and whom I find, okay, they have their own ideas, they have their opinions, but they are pretty objective as far as the material evidence is concerned, and yet they come up with very, very different narratives. That's part of the game in a way. Yeah. So we'll have to continue trying and looking for what seems most reasonable.
It's part of the game of assembling the clues, so to speak, before you arrive at a coherent story. So anyway, so we're in the middle of that game, but we want to conclude today with thanking everybody who stuck around in the webinar. And Michel, thank you so much for participating. It's pretty late in India. We hope you'll come back and participate in a future webinar, but wonderful to have you with us today. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kalinji. Thank you, Ankur.
Thank you. It's amazing. We're going to follow your work. And we look forward to unearthing more of this ancient archaeology and history. Again, thank you so much for joining us. The 200 people still on. I'm just going to drop orientation to Hindu studies in the chat. Please consider taking that course at HUA, where we lay out the framework, and we're offering all sorts of courses at HUA. If you can just join us for our weekly webinars, please continue joining us. We're building this platform to raise these important issues. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time. Again, Michel, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to leave now. Okay.
Bye.
Namaste, everybody. Thank you.
Namaste.
Bye.